But the, the title of my presentation is Radical Imagination. And radical imagination, well, it could go not only to this topic that we're discussing today, subjectivization, but I think it could very well fit into the other one, new institutionality. But I think this is the beauty of the glossary. You can really be in flux and connect terms and so on. So that's not a problem at all. What is radical education? Radical education is a process of constructing something. And this something could be, as we heard today quite a few times, a text, a book, a work of art, a concept, but also a will to live, to create, to love, to invent another society, another value system, and so on. And maybe radical education, it's in a way what Miguel was saying, it's resonant in this concept, politics of becoming. And I'm sure there are many others that I could think of. So all these processes of constructing something, they have to do with procedures of subjectivization, our topic today. Radical imagination is not about a certain political potential of an artwork or its emancipation from representational regime, but it's about desire. Desire as the driving force of exploration, which surfaces at some fundamental encounters at the junction of politics, art, philosophy, or, for example, madness. And while doing so, while crossing these domains and territories, venturing into something unknown, and taking risk, and this risk could potentially lead towards something new. And it's important to say that while venturing into something new will also break in the habit. And this is what some philosophers are talking about. It's important to consider breaking the habit. Imagination and desire are closely connected. Well, imagination ceased to be the medium of knowledge already very long ago with the birth of modern science, and has merely become something excluded from real experience. A subject of mental alienation, as Agamben put it. And if you think back in antiquity, the imagination was the supreme medium of knowledge. And if we think some other cultures, we know that, for example, the role dreams and visions still play in those cultures. Which basically means institutionalized discourses and the authority of knowledge take over the imagination. And this process is something that Agamben says, history that is not yet. Of course, this takeover cannot be prevented, but once we rethink art in a different way, not necessarily as representations, but rather as intensities or affects, where art has a performative rather than representational character, then there is a potential for new possible transversal alliances based on different kind of poetics of a political that you also mentions a lot, Lisette. So what kind of politics are we actually talking about? In order to answer that question, let's go back a bit. Art, as we have learned, through various narratives and concepts, has to do with history, of course. And more importantly, art, as we know it through various forms, is already part of the past. And it is, to put it plainly, of the identifiable and formalized affects that become as such through numerous encounters with different bodies, objects, ideas, institutions, etc. Both the state and the institution fear the unknown affects because those affects threaten the established order and, for that matter, anything that is fixed, for example, identity, confined, that is aesthetic, and taken for granted, representation. But something, a force, always escape this confinement, and that is where the encounters between art and other bodies should be investigated. So, Susan Buck-Morss has proposed the idea of somatic knowledge. And today we heard Sueli mentioning knowing body And Lisette was talking about Oiticica's concept, bodies wise. But what Susan Buck-Morse has proposed with this idea, that she understands this somatic knowledge as a way the body senses reality in an animalistic or biological sense. For her, this kind of aesthetic is a body's form of critical cognition, a knowing that can be trusted politically because it cannot be instrumentalized. And if we think of art as a block of affects and percepts, then art is like an electrical shock, which always happens as event and only at this very moment. Well, museums, of course, cannot store affects the way they store objects, but their task remains, nevertheless, to preserve all that which makes art art. And art, as we already know, is made of affects. On the other hand, museum itself is an affective body too, which to some extent defines and orchestrates other bodies, things, objects, ideas, other effects, and so on. However, there is a difference in the way bodies were affected. For example, now I'm going to show, I have 3 images, and I'm going to show one. It's a, yeah. This is Tomislav Gotovac. No, a wrong one. I'm sorry, another one. This is also Tomislav Gotovac, but another project. So there is a difference in the way bodies were affected. For example, by Tomislav Gotovac, when he cleaned the streets of Zagreb in 1981, and by the residue of that event, which you can see in that image, the residue of that event is a pile of garbage. And this pile of garbage, this residue is in the collection of our museum. Or another event from the same year, where Tomislav Gotovac walked naked in downtown Zagreb. And this event was an unmediated experience, but only until its effects were recognized as signifying gestures, perceived as a threat to the order of the state, which means that after 7 minutes, Gotovac was arrested by the police. Now, what are the prospects of effects in the zone of a museum? Museum, as any institution, attempts to prevent the appearance of uncontrolled effects. There are, however, exceptions. Well known is the performance Rhythm Zero by Marina Abramović from 1964, also in the collection of our museum, where she offered herself to the public in a gallery as a passive object, during which the public could do anything they wanted to her. Abramović purposely exceeded her power of being affected to such an extreme that after the performance was over, and she in a way became a subject again, the public could not bear to face the artist any longer and literally run away from her and the gallery premises. What happened was that the threshold of intensity had been crossed, and subsequently a difficult encounter transpired. So, of course, we have other cases. Lisette was mentioning Oiticica, and then we could also put into this group drifts by the situationists and surrealists who were concerned with the emancipation of thought and recognized imagination as a powerful weapon, and so on and so on. So what I want to ask is, what is the connection between affects and politics in the context of a museum? And how do museums deal with the limits of being affected? And what do these excesses produce? What kind of subjectivities are constructed within these encounters? And I will very briefly talk about a project method encounter called Radical Education that happened in relation to Moderna Galleria, and this happened since 2006. And the people involved in this process came from various domains: political activism, migrant movements, anarchism, art, anthropology, and so on. And there were many debates from the start. For example, about participatory multicultural project, because, for one, we did not want radical education to be understood as a kind of participatory project within an art institution or part of the prevailing multicultural paradigm. Our opinion was that such temporary solidarities, such identification between minorities, marginalized and other groups, the projection of politics as other and outside, only detracts from a politics of here and now. So the idea was to create a contact surface between social movements and the art institution, and to invent new institutional forms of resistance, new political subjectivities, new affective excesses, so to speak. But more important than creating a space within a space of an art institution was the involvement with certain materials of expression, with groups, individuals, and always with some kind of outside to open up a new universe of reference. It meant that we began to ask, what, why, and how is it that my body agrees with the other affective body? Or put another way, what can my body actually do? What is it that is common between my body and another body? What is the meaning of such encounter? And also for the encounter between art institution and social center. One of the aims of radical education was to define, I'll mention just one process very briefly, was to define common investigation between the two fields, art and politics, and to ascertain through concepts such as power, work, labor, aesthetic experience, affects, and other subjective components embedded in the work process and the work itself, what is it that art forms and forms of political resistance have in common? For example, a question that we found very important and around which we organized a series of seminars, Resistance as Creation, together with migrant workers, political activists, and cultural workers in Ljubljana was, what is creation? What is radical imagination? Not only from the perspective of artwork, but also from the point of productive process being an aesthetic experience itself. Is manual work as such an aesthetic experience? What about art, which repeats labor? Is this experience limited only to the spaces of art museums, or can it spread everywhere? Is it a collective creation by artists, becoming a collective worker, or a representation made by individual? Can art function as a tool of emancipation? Of course, it's important to emphasize that radical education position was not only to compose a meaningful and relevant set of questions, but above all, to implement and confront those questions in collective situations, to democratize expert knowing, and to produce common one instead. Recently, madness has been one of the domains here in Moderna Galleria within the exhibition Politicization of Friendship, and where madness transferred art and politics. Similarly as radical education before, and based on the same points of departure, madness, or more precisely anti-psychiatrist movement from the 80s, entered the space of an art institution. Madness understood as something that creates paradox within an institution. Madness as thinking that discomforts, all the while escaping control, stretching the limits of affective excesses of an institution. People from the anti-psychiatrist movement told us, it's not about problematizing madness as such, but society's attitude towards it. Madness is one of the creative principles and a driving source, and it should be protected as such. What we have learned from radical education is that what art and social movements and lately anti-psychiatrist movements have in common, it's not about content, such as art views and social resistance. It's also not the assumption that the site of artistic transformation can also be the site of political and social transformation. It's rather the question of how not to be separated from our power of acting and how to produce adequate ideas, increasing the power to act, this is what Spinoza would say, which concerns not only individual forces, but also collective bodies, forming common notions or common relations between bodies. And this is what I understand under subjectivization in this context of transversality.
No, it's a very, very short question. I'm just wondering what is the specificity of the idea of imagination? Because you are dealing with this problem of radical education for a very long time. That is a subject you have been working on, and I don't know, because at the beginning, I think that there was a kind of lapsus where you start talking about radical education, but you were talking about the very beginning concept. So just to, or maybe the concept is radical desire. That is something you include also in the issue.
Well, yes, it could be radical desire. It could be anything. It's just something that's themed out of the concept of the working of the process of the methodology within radical education. But it's thinking about this potential that not only artworks, but anything that enters our art museum has. And what does it do when it transversally crosses other domains? And it could be, as you said, radical desire, it could be anything. It's just some word that I think suited what we were thinking.
I'm going in the same direction. In the middle of your presentation, I was thinking that maybe just radical would be enough, because then with radical you can construct radical desire, radical love, radical object. I don't know, it's interesting. I have another point for your work. And yeah, but there is something that I don't know if you read it today, but it is in this paper, that seems to me also very interesting. Let us think about it for tomorrow. It is, I think for me, it can be a concept. It's not yet.
Mm-hmm.
You put it into brackets.
Because it's by Agamben's concept, history that it's not yet. And it deals with imagination that he said was expunged from knowledge with the Descartes, with cogito ergo sum.
You didn't put the quotation here, and not yet in French. What? Pas encore? I don't remember. Pas encore. Not.
No. History and infancy.
Because in the process of your thinking, I imagine that you are very much interested in the impulse of the desire before institutionalization.
Before it finds this medium.
Yeah.
Before it settles itself in a medium. Yes.
So in this sense, the not yet concept would work perfectly.
Mm-hmm. It could. I mean, it's very open field. You can attach a lot of concepts to it, and you can do it here in the platform.
But we are increasing the platform, so not
that's good.
Not
I mean,
yet
it's
already
good.
somewhere.
And it's not really a question, it's just a comment, but as when I was listening to Miguel's presentation, I was thinking this idea of travesti is also a nice way to think about a possible model for a museum to operate, actually, in travesti. And I think there's something similar in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of the radical imagination of a museum and how that could operate.
I think all three of us, this was some really, some common point of the portrait.
That was it.
Just a very short comment, just to highlight another term from your description, which is transversal linkage, that I think is very much in the core of what you were exposing.
Also, yeah. True.